Last week we talked about Jesus and being anointed by this woman in a gathering when he was having dinner with some folks. This week we're going to be looking at the arrest and the cross, going to the crucifixion. Next week we're going to look at Jesus' words on the cross, and then we'll land on Easter Sunday talking about the resurrection. Spoiler alert, he comes back from the dead. So just so you know. So thankful for that. I do want to mention too that for this week and straight through Easter, we're gonna skip having communion together. And you may hear that and say, but this is a week we should do communion, which, yes, I agree. There's always a good reason to do communion. But part of what we focus on during certain seasons within the church calendar is kind of shocking our systems to think differently, right? So there's something about pausing to reflect that Jesus offers us communion with him and with the Father through what he does on the cross, but it cost dearly, right? And his communion with God in some form was broken. His relationship with others was broken. And so the next handful of weeks, and when I close the sermon, we're going to go right into responding in song, just to remind us that communion is not a given. It's a given because of what Jesus has done, right? So the next 2 weeks, we won't be celebrating communion. And then generally on Easter Sundays, we don't celebrate communion just because a lot of new people come, and we really want folks to have an understanding of what communion is. And there's a lot of moving parts on Easter Sunday, and so we usually skip doing it that. But just so you know, coming up after Easter, we will go back and celebrating communion every week. So today I want to do something a little bit different in that what I usually do is I land in one text and we dig into one text. But what I want to do is I'm going to share a bunch of scriptures that are around the arrest and Jesus going to the cross. And so if you want notes, you want to take notes, I will share what the scriptures are. It's probably going to be challenging to flip there as quickly as I go to the different places. But I want to give you a picture today. And so today we're going to talk about Jesus going to the cross. And the cross is this amazing juxtaposition. Because on one hand, when we think about the cross, we think about redemption, the forgiveness of sins, Jesus ushering in this new covenant, no more sacrifices after Jesus. And so that's the beauty of the cross. There's also the brutality of the cross, right? This is a tool that was used to execute people in that time, and it was considered one of the most heinous ways to do it. It was created because of its brutality. The Roman authorities wanted people in general to know that if you saw someone being crucified, this was the worst kind of criminal. The fact that Jesus was sort of tried. It was a trial, but it wasn't a fair trial. This man who is totally innocent is put to death on a cross. So there's this beauty of what the cross does. There's also the brutality of the cross. There's a theology we can understand about what happens on the cross. Today, I want us to embrace the theology and the truth of what happens. And at the same time, I want you to kind of tap into the emotions of what it would look like to be in the presence of Jesus or with Jesus as he heads to the cross. Sometimes we can kind of get in the place where we know the facts, but we don't enter into the deeper heart and soul place of considering what does the arrest of Jesus look like? What does the crucifixion look like? So I want us to hold those two things in tension today, the theology of the cross and also the emotion of the cross. And to do that, I want to look into three different areas. I want to talk about the betrayal of Jesus. I want to talk about the abandonment of Jesus. And I want to talk about the fact, and yet, in the midst of all that, Jesus offers grace. So betrayal and abandonment and grace. So let me start by reading a passage from Luke chapter 22, verses 1-6. Here's what we read. It says, "Now the festival of unleavened bread called the Passover was approaching. And the chief priests and the teachers of the law were looking for some way to get rid of Jesus, for they were afraid of the people. Then Satan entered Judas, called Iscariot, one of the 12. And Judas went to the chief priests and the officers of the temple guard and discussed with them how he might betray Jesus. They were delighted and agreed to give him money. He consented and watched for an opportunity to hand Jesus over to them when no crowd was present." So let's talk about this idea of betrayal. Let's try to enter into that space. What does it feel like to be betrayed? What does it feel like to be in the life of Jesus and to feel like you have people around you who you think you can trust, and then it turns out to be totally different than what you thought? I thought about for myself. I was in a conversation years ago with a pastor, one of the senior leaders at this other church, and I had conversation with some other leaders about some differences we had and how we were approaching things. And so in a very cordial way, we were in this setting where we were discussing philosophy of ministry and church life. And so I said to the senior leader, I just think we approach this thing differently. And there were a couple other people in the room. And so I turned to them, I said, don't you think that's true? Now, I knew that they thought it was true because I had conversations with a variety of people about this. And it wasn't a moral issue, it was just a difference of opinion. But in that setting, when I looked at the senior leader and said, I just think we do some things differently, and I looked at these other folks, I said, don't you think that's true? Then they were like, no, I don't think it's true. I don't think it's true. And I had to put my game face on. I was like, I didn't want to, I felt betrayed in that moment. I didn't want to betray them back and go, we literally talked about this 2 days ago, so why are you saying that? But it was a moment when you expect someone to kind of come to your aid or agree with you on something, and then they say something totally different, right? Now, that wasn't a life or death situation, but imagine what it was like for Jesus to be in this situation, and then all of a sudden, Judas goes and betrays him. I wrote down these notes. How long do you have to know somebody before you're certain they won't betray you? Is it a week, a month, a year? Maybe it's 3 years. 3 years that the disciples spent with Jesus as he carried out his earthly ministry, walking down dusty roads together. Imagine watching the hands of the Savior placed on someone and they receive their sight. Someone who can't walk and now they stand. Imagine being in the presence of that, signs and wonders, casting out demons, healing the sick, giving sight to the blind, miracle after miracle after miracle, and then yet you decide, I'll turn my back on this person. The thing that's important about betrayal interpersonally is that there's always an actor and then a recipient. Betrayal is not just a concept out there. There's people involved, right? There's someone who's doing it and there's someone who's receiving the betrayal. And the deeper and the more intimate the relationship is, the more painful the betrayal is. When you feel like you could really, really trust someone and then they turn their back on you, your response is what? Your brain tries to process it and it's this must not be happening. I must be seeing this incorrectly because there's no way this person would do that to me. And yeah, that's what Jesus experienced. Listen to the Gospel of Matthew 26, verses 47 to 48. It says, while he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, suddenly arrived. A large mob with swords and clubs was with him, from the chief priests and the elders of the people. I love the way Matthew describes it. It says, his betrayer had given them a sign. The one I kiss is the one. Arrest him. So he went right up to Jesus and said, greetings, Rabbi, and kissed him. Not just betrayed, but betrayed with a kiss. If you read the New Testament, Paul will even say things like, greet one another with a holy kiss. It's a sign of care. It's a sign of connection. Maybe one of the most sacred moments when you think about a kiss is when the officiant at a wedding says, what God has joined together, may no man separate. You may now kiss the bride. When I do that, when I'm officiating weddings, I always tell the couple, wait for 1 second so I can step out of the way so I'm not in the picture of you guys kissing on your wedding day. You know, this beautiful kiss and my head in the background I want to do that every time, but I don't. But I want you to imagine on the other side, imagine this, right? Imagine my wedding day back in 2005 that the pastor says, you may kiss your bride. And then I kiss Jenny. And then as I back away, I say to her, I'm not sure if I love you. I mean, imagine what that would feel like. That's what betrayal feels like. And Judas, with a kiss, betrays Jesus. Comes up to him, embraces him, gives him a kiss. Continuing in Luke 22, it says, then seizing him, they led him away, and took him into the house of the high priest. Peter followed at a distance, and when some had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard, they sat down together. Peter sat with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, This man was with him. But he denied it. Woman, I don't know him. He said. A little later, someone else saw him and said, You also are one of them. Man, I am not, Peter replied. About an hour later, another asserted, Certainly this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean. Peter replied, Man, I don't know what you're talking about. And just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times. And he, Peter, went outside and wept bitterly. It's one thing to avoid a person. It's another thing in the presence of that person to say, I don't know that person. It's one thing to not be there, but it's another thing to be within eyeshot of another person and to say, never met him. Not long before this, Jesus had asked Peter about who people think he is. And then specifically asked Peter, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then shortly after, Peter says, I never met him. That is what betrayal looks like. And that was Jesus' experience as he heads to the cross. So there's one reality of Jesus' life, betrayed. Let's think about this idea of being alone and abandoned now. Matthew 26 says this, when Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to them, sit here while I go over there and pray. He took Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee along with him. He began to be sorrowful and troubled. And then he said, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me. Going a little farther, he fell to his face, with his face to the ground and prayed, my Father, if it is possible, make this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. Couldn't you men keep watch with me for just 1 hour? He asked Peter. The moment of deepest loneliness is the exact moment when you desperately need another and no one's there. The moment of deepest loneliness is the exact moment when you need the other person, but they're not there. And that's what Jesus experiences in this moment. Like, being alone is inconsequential if you want to be alone. Right? If somebody says, I just need some quiet time by myself, and you're like, I will never abandon you. They're like, hey, weirdo, let me be alone. Right? It feels like they're clingy at that point, right? I love to spend time in the woods, and I actually like to spend time alone in the woods. Like, you can sit me by a tree for a good 2 hours, and I'm completely content. And it doesn't have to be something big and impressive out in front of me. I can just look through the dirt around me and watch the leaves. But I'll tell you what, the reason that it doesn't feel like I'm abandoned is because I know I have a place to go back to. The reason I don't feel lonely is because while I'm alone in that moment, I know I have a place to return to. Jesus in this moment needed his friends with him, and they abandoned him. When you are wrestling in your soul, when you are praying so deeply that your body is responding such that you start to have blood overflow from your skin, that's when you need to know, I'm not alone and I'm not abandoned. And yet, in that moment, that's exactly what happened. Jesus was abandoned by his friends. He wanted them to be with him, physically nearby, emotionally and spiritually connected, but there was this massive chasm. Jesus was abandoned by those closest to him. Listen to what Matthew 26 says. As they come to arrest Jesus, he says, am I leading a rebellion that you have come with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me. But this has all taken place that the writings of the prophet might be fulfilled. It says, then all the disciples deserted him and fled. Jesus wasn't alone because the disciples forgot they had a meeting with him. They were there, and then they abandoned him. Jesus was alone because the disciples chose to leave. Here's what I wrote down. They looked into the face of their Savior, and then they looked at the soldiers, and they fled. Being alone or abandoned because someone forgot to show up stings. But when people choose to not be there for you, that's a different type of abandonment. Jesus was shipwrecked in a sea of faces. And at the moment when his life is going to be ebbing away, he's abandoned. And then going to the cross in Matthew 27, it says, from noon until 3 p.m, darkness came over the land. About 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, we can have a whole discussion on theologically what that looks like and what that means. But Jesus is at least expressing that not only does he feel like his friends have abandoned him, but that his own Father has as well. So betrayed and abandoned. It would make sense for us to go, and now Jesus pours out his wrath at those who've left him. But that's not Jesus. Betrayed and abandoned, and yet grace is offered. Grace was on display in the God-man because in this moment, we see it oozing out of him. Listen to this from John 19. It says, near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Cleopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved, who was John, standing nearby, he said to her, woman, here is your son. And to the disciple, here is your mother. And from that time on, this disciple took her into his home. The Apostle John, who had denied Jesus, is now given a new family member. After his crucifixion, Jesus would reinstate this Peter, the one who said, I do not know this man. Peter would reinstate him and say to him, Peter, feed my sheep. Thomas, who after the resurrection is doubting. Thomas, who bailed on Jesus, is reinstated. And if church tradition is right, Thomas travels to the ends of the known world at that point, to India to preach the gospel. Betrayed and abandoned, and yet the grace of Christ to those who turn their back on him. Luke 22, it says, when Jesus' followers saw what was going to happen at his arrest, they said, Lord, should we strike with our swords? And one of them struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. But Jesus answered, no more of this. And he touched the man's ear and he healed him. So they come to arrest Jesus. This mob of people, his disciples go to defend him. They remove the ear, and yet Jesus heals this man. If anyone is turning their back on the Savior, yes, the disciples, but this mob coming to arrest him as well, and yet grace from Jesus. Don't cut off his ear. And I wonder if in that moment the disciples thought this sounds and looks familiar to what he said earlier in his ministry when he said, it is one thing to love your friends, but I say love your enemies and pray for those who curse you. Grace. Luke 23 says, 2 other men, both criminals, were also led out with him to be executed. And when they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him along with these 2 criminals, one on his right and one on the left. And Jesus says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. And then they divided up his clothes by casting lots. I want to read you exactly what I wrote here. Think about this with me. Not just those who argued with him, not just those who were contentious toward him, not even just the mob who said, crucify him, but even for those who scourged and crucified him, Jesus offered grace. They tortured him, they put him to death, and yet there's something in him that wants them to know the forgiveness offered by God. They killed him, and yet He's offering grace. The scary and beautiful reality of this arrest story of Jesus is that you and I are the disciples. You and I might be the soldiers. You and I, on a regular basis, know clearly what Jesus would have us to do, and yet we do different. But the response of Jesus is not betrayal for our betrayal or abandonment for our abandonment. It's grace. When people ask you, what is God like? This is what God is like. There's a pastor whose name is Thabite Anawabile, and he says this: Gethsemane's silent answer rings eternally in the loud, joyous praises of the universe. There's betrayal, there's abandonment, and there's grace. And that's what Jesus offers to us. As we move towards the cross next week and then the resurrection, may we sit in that space, remembering that this all lands with the love, the mercy, and the grace of God.